The bride ducked under his doorway. The widowed rancher laughed for the first time. The hinge on the front door had been loose since October of '78. I kept meaning to fix it. Never did. That's the thing I remember first. Not her face, not her dress, not the coach dust still gray on her collar. The hinge, the way it shrieked when I pushed the door wide to let her in, and she ducked without thinking because the lintel on that side hung low where the adobe had settled, and I'd never thought to warn her, and she just ducked, clean and easy, like she'd known. I stood there with my hand still on the door. She straightened up and looked at me, set her bag down by her left boot, didn't smile yet, just looked. "Mr. Calhoun," she said. "Miss Voss," I said back. That was the whole of our greeting. 4 years of silence in this house, and those were the first words I'd spoken to a woman inside it since the morning Ruth died. I need to back up, I guess. I always start in the wrong place when I tell this. My name is Elias Calhoun. I ran cattle in the Sulphur Creek Basin, southeast of Tucson, on land I'd broken with my own hands starting in the spring of '69. Ruth and I had come west from Missouri with $40 and a mule and a wagon that lost a wheel outside of Santa Fe and had to be lashed together with rawhide and stubbornness. We built the main house ourselves, the two of us. She'd mix the adobe while I cut the frames. We'd work until dark and then sit on the unfinished floor and eat cold biscuits, and she'd talk about the garden she was going to plant when the house was done. Roses, she wanted, and cilantro, and a kitchen window that faced east so she could watch the sun come up while she cooked. She died in March of '74. Fever came on fast and took her in 9 days, and there was nothing the doctor in Tucson could do, nothing I could do, nothing anybody could do, and I buried her under the mesquite at the east edge of the property where she'd said she wanted her garden to be. Because I hadn't built the window facing east yet. I hadn't gotten to it. That's the thing about losing someone. It's all the things you hadn't gotten to yet. After that I worked. That's what I did. Rose before dawn, worked until dark, ate whatever tamaz my hand. A good man, been with me since '71, left on the stove, went to sleep, did it again. We ran about 400 head on the best years. I had 2 other hands by '76, Denny and a Tohono O'odham man named Francisco who could read weather in the sky better than any almanac I'd ever bought. They were good men. We worked well. I didn't talk much. They didn't require it. We understood each other. The house stayed the way Ruth had left it. I didn't move her things. Her good blue shawl stayed on the peg by the door until the moths got into it, and then I folded what was left of it and put it in the cedar box under the bed. Her cast iron skillet stayed on the hook above the stove. I cooked in it every morning. I don't know why, I just did. I didn't go to town much. Didn't need to. Tamaz or Denny made the supply runs. When I did go, women looked at me the way people look at a building that's been abandoned, like they're calculating what it would take to fix it, or whether it's worth the trouble. I was 43 years old and I'd stopped caring either way. The basin had its own rhythms and I had mine, and they matched well enough. Spring branding, summer fence repair, fall roundup, winter on the bones of the operation, keeping it alive until the grass came back. I knew every foot of the south pasture fence, every moody spring on the property, every place the rock went soft and let the water seep through. I knew the ranch the way you know a person you've lived beside long enough, not romantically, just the truth of it, the reliable and the unreliable, and the places you'd learned to compensate. It was mine. I'd made it from nothing and I was keeping it, which in that country at that time was more than a lot of men managed. That should have been enough. Some days it was. It was Frank Alderman who planted the idea. Frank ran the lazy F2 Valleys over, good man, full of opinions. Came by in the fall of '77 to talk about a fence dispute on the East Ridge and stayed for supper, and somewhere between the beef and the coffee he said, casual as a man commenting on weather, "You know what you need, Elias? A woman in that house." "I had one," I said. "I know you did. I'm not talking about replacing Ruth. He looked at me straight, which Frank always did. It was the thing I respected about him. I'm talking about a life. You're living like a man waiting to die. I told him he could go to hell in a friendly way, and he laughed and let it go. But it sat with me. I won't pretend it didn't. Not because Frank was right about what I needed. I wasn't sure anything about what I needed anymore, but because the house was quiet in a way that had started to feel like pressure. Like the quiet itself was a weight I was carrying, and I'd been carrying it so long I'd stopped noticing I was bent. There are different kinds of quiet. There's the quiet of a morning when the work hasn't started yet and the land is still, and you're the only thing moving in it, and that kind of quiet is good, it fills you up. Then there's the quiet that's left after something has been taken out of a house, and that kind settles into the corners and the floorboards and it doesn't fill you. It just occupies. After 4 years, the second kind had gotten into everything. In January of '78, I wrote to an agency in St. Louis. Took me 3 attempts. The letter I sent was plain and short, and probably not what the agency was used to receiving. I said I was a cattle rancher in Arizona Territory, 44 years of age, widower of 4 years, 2,000 acres, solvent. I said I wanted a woman of honest character who wasn't afraid of hard work and didn't expect softness from the country or from me, because I had neither to offer. I said I would correspond first, and I would be truthful about the ranch and myself, and I expected the same in return. I did not say I was lonely. I didn't know how to say that, or whether it was even the right word. The agency sent me 3 names. I wrote to all 3, politely, and 2 of them wrote back, and within a few months it was clear they wanted something I wasn't going to be. One wanted a man who'd move back east eventually. One wanted children quickly, and I wasn't sure I had that in me anymore. The 3rd letter I almost didn't open, because by then I was starting to feel like the whole thing had been a foolish idea, and maybe Frank Alderman should mind his own business. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 31, from a small town outside of Cincinnati, schoolteacher for 6 years. Father had died, mother had remarried, she had saved a little money and wanted a life that was hers. She wrote in short sentences, no flourishes. She said, I am not a romantic. I don't think I'm looking for romance. I think I'm looking for a place and a person I can be honest with, and I'd rather know what I'm walking into than be surprised by it. Tell me the hard things about the ranch. Tell me what you're like to live with. I can make up my own mind. I read that letter twice standing at the kitchen table, and then I sat down and read it again. I wrote back and told her the hard things, that the nearest town was 22 miles and the road turned to mud twice a year, that I had a temper that ran cold rather than hot, which some people found worse, that I was not a man who talked much about what he felt, and I didn't expect to change that. That the house was plain and the winters were harder than people back east imagined, and that Ruth, I told her about Ruth, not everything, but enough, that Ruth had been the warmth in this house, and I did not know if that warmth was still here or if she'd taken it with her. She wrote back. She said she'd thought about it for a week. She said she appreciated that I'd told her the truth. She said she was not looking for warmth exactly. She was looking for steadiness. She said, a cold-running man who says what he means is easier to live with than a warm one who doesn't. We wrote for 5 months, not love letters. They were nothing like love letters. They were the correspondence of 2 careful people trying to know each other across a distance, and I looked forward to them in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Not because they were tender, they weren't. Because they were honest. Because she pushed back when I said something she disagreed with. Because she had opinions about everything from livestock feeding schedules to territorial statehood, and she stated them plainly, and didn't soften them for my benefit. She wrote about teaching not fondly exactly, but with the particular knowledge of someone who'd done a thing long and knew its insides. She said the children who struggled most weren't the slow ones. They were the ones who'd been told they were slow and believed it. She said she found it harder to undo what someone had been told about themselves than to teach reading from scratch. I thought about that for a couple of days after I read it, out in the pasture, doing fence work. I don't know exactly why. In June, she wrote and said, I think I'd like to come out and see for myself. If it doesn't suit, I'll say so and there won't be any hard feelings. I wrote back and said that suited me fine. Tamaz drove the wagon in to meet the Tucson stage. I stayed at the ranch. I told myself it was because the east pasture fence needed checking, which was true, but that was not the reason. I was afraid. I hadn't been afraid of much in a long time. Fear had sort of dried up in me the way the creek beds dried up in July, present maybe underneath but not running. But that morning I checked the east fence and then I came back and walked through the house and looked at it the way she would see it. The low ceiling in the main room, the worn boards, the peg where Ruth's shawl had been. I'd taken the cedar box out from under the bed and put it in the barn in the tack room because I didn't know what else to do with it, and it felt wrong to leave it where it was. Ruth's skillet was still on the hook. I didn't move that. I walked through the main room and the kitchen and I thought, this is a house with the life gone out of it, and there's no hiding that from anyone with eyes. Whatever Clara Voss was expecting, it wasn't going to be this. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard the wagon. I went to the door and opened it, and that's when the hinge shrieked and she ducked. Clara Voss was a medium-height woman with brown hair she kept pinned up and gray eyes that were the color of creek water in November. She was not beautiful the way Ruth had been beautiful. Ruth had had a kind of light to her that people noticed across a room, but she was not plain either. She had a face that was used. That sounds like an unkind thing to say, and I don't mean it that way. I mean she had a face that showed she'd been somewhere. That she'd thought things and felt things and they'd left a mark, the way living does when you don't run from it. She looked around the main room, didn't say anything. Tamaz brought her bags in and excused himself with a tact I've always appreciated in the man, and then it was just the two of us standing in the house I'd built and gone half dead inside of, looking at each other. You said plain, she said. You weren't lying about that. No, I said. She walked to the kitchen doorway and looked in. She looked at the skillet on the hook. She looked at the east-facing wall where there was no window. She didn't ask about it. She came back and sat down at the table without being invited, which was somehow exactly right. Coffee, I said. Please. I made it. We sat across from each other at the table where I had eaten alone for 4 years, and we drank coffee and talked, or she talked and I mostly answered, and she asked questions about the ranch, real questions, the kind with some thought behind them, about the water rights on the south pasture, about what I lost in a bad year, about Francisco's weather reading which I'd mentioned in one of my letters, and she wanted to know how he did it, what he looked at. I told her about the way he watched how the cattle moved and the color of the western sky at noon, and she listened with the particular quality of attention that means a person is actually storing what you're saying rather than just waiting for their turn. I'd forgotten what that felt like, being listened to like that, or maybe I'd never had it in quite this particular way. Ruth listened differently with her heart in it, warm and present. Clara listened the way you'd check the fit of a joint in a piece of timber, careful, testing, genuinely wanting to know if it held. It was different. It was not lesser. It was just a different kind of regard. After a while she said, "Your letters were better than I expected." What'd you expect? Terse, dutiful, a man going through the motions. Maybe I was. Maybe, she said, but you told me the truth. That counts for something. She looked at her coffee. Most men don't. Tell the truth. Think it matters in this context. They figure a woman coming out here will take what she's offered. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Your letter was different. You told me about Ruth. I didn't say anything for a moment. The evening light was coming through the west window, the one that faced west, because that was the one I'd gotten to, and it lay across the table between us in a long stripe. I thought you should know, I said. I'm glad I do. She looked up at me. I'm not here to replace her, Mr. Calhoun. I wouldn't know how and I wouldn't try. I'm here to see if there's a life here I could be part of, Those are different things. Elias, I said. She nodded once. Elias. She'd come for 2 weeks to start, with the understanding that at the end of 2 weeks we'd both say plainly what we thought. That was her condition, and I'd agreed to it in writing, and I respected her the more for requiring it. The first few days were careful. We were polite in the way of people who don't know yet where the edges are. She helped in the kitchen without asking permission, which I appreciated, and she cooked better than I did, which was not hard. She ate supper with me and Tomás and Denny and Francisco. The hands ate at the house most evenings, had since Ruth died, because it seemed inhospitable otherwise. And she asked them questions, real ones, and she remembered what they said and referenced it later. And I watched the way they warmed to her in the careful way of men who have been on their own for a long time and are not sure yet if this is a good thing. Francisco, who almost never said more than he needed to, told her one evening about his daughter back at the San Xavier mission, who was learning to read. Clara said without missing a beat that if the girl ever wanted readers sent, she knew how to get them cheap, that she had a connection with a school in Tucson that sometimes discarded books. Francisco looked at her for a long moment in the way he looked at the sky when he was reading something true in it, and then he nodded and went back to his supper, and I thought, something just happened there. She'd done it without ceremony, without making it a kindness to point at. She'd just done it. She was up before dawn the second morning. I came into the kitchen, and she was already at the stove with the fire going and coffee on, and she was standing at the east wall with her hands on the windowsill, the sill where the window wasn't, because I'd never put it in looking at the adobe. There ought to be a window here, she said, not turning around. I know. You started to say something about it in one of your letters. Then you didn't. I know, I said again. She turned around and looked at me and didn't ask. She just looked with those creekwater eyes, and she understood something about it and she let it be. She poured the coffee and handed me a cup, and that was all. I don't know why that made me feel the way it did. Something eased somewhere, like a gate that's been wound too tight finally settling back. She'd understood without me having to explain it, which was its own thing, the understanding that doesn't require you to bleed for it. On the 5th day we rode the south pasture together. She'd ridden before, Missouri farm stock, and she sat a horse well enough. We went out in the early morning when the light was low and long, and the desert smelled of the rain that had come the night before, wet creosote and damp rock, a smell I still can't describe exactly except to say it smells like the land breathing. We didn't talk much out there. We didn't need to. I showed her where the water came up in the good years and where the fence ran, and where I'd had the trouble with the Hosser brothers 3 years back, a grazing dispute that had nearly turned bad before Frank Alderman brokered a settlement over a bottle of rye. She listened. She asked 2 or 3 questions that cut straight to the core of things. What was my plan if the water dropped lower? Whether the Hosser dispute was really settled or just tamped down. I told her the truth on both. The south pasture in the early morning was the best thing on the property. The grass came up yellow-green, and the light hit it sideways, and the cattle moved through it slowly with that particular bovine patience that makes everything seem less urgent than it probably is. I'd ridden it 10,000 times, and I never got tired of it. I watched her face while we rode, and I could see her taking it in, not rapturously, not the way tourists from back east looked at the landscape, with that performed wonder that always felt a little hollow. She looked at it the way she looked at the water rights situation, as a fact to understand. This is what we have. This is what it is. All right. Riding back, she said, "You've built something real out here." "It's a ranch," I said. "More than that." She was looking ahead, not at me. "You put this here out of nothing, you and Ruth, on land that didn't want to be ranched. You've kept it going for 4 years on your own." A pause. "That's not nothing, Elias." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what to do with being told something like that by someone who meant it. I wasn't used to it. The people in town looked at me with either pity or that careful blankness that means they'd heard I was going odd, out there alone, and they weren't sure what to make of it. The hands respected me the way men respect a capable employer, which is a genuine thing but not this thing. This was a stranger looking at what I'd built and calling it real, naming it accurately. I'd forgotten, or maybe never quite known, what it felt like to have someone see what you'd made and say straight out that it counted. We rode back in and unsaddled the horses, and she went to the house, and I stood in the barn for a few minutes with my hand on the horse's neck, just standing there. Denny came through on his way to the water trough and looked at me and looked away again with the courtesy of a good man who knows when not to say a thing. 7 days in, she came to me in the evening with a look on her face I hadn't seen yet. We'd been sitting after supper. She'd made a pork stew that Denny said was the best thing he'd eaten since his mother died, which from Denny was a significant declaration, and the others had gone, and it was just the two of us at the table. She'd been quiet for a little while, and I'd been reading. I'd taken up reading again in the past year, mostly history, something to do with the evenings that wasn't just sitting in the silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The cedar box in the tack room." I set the book down. "I wasn't snooping," she said. "I went in for a saddle blanket. It was sitting on the shelf plain as anything." She looked at me steady. "I didn't open it." "Ruth's things," I said. "I figured." A pause. "You moved it when I came." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." Didn't know what else to do with it. "Put it back," she said. "Under the bed where it belongs. This is her house too, Elia's." "I'm not at war with a dead woman." She said it plainly, without sentiment, the way she said everything. "Ruth built this place with you. She should be in it." I looked at her. She held my gaze and didn't look away. "You're a plain-speaking woman," I said. "I told you that in my first letter." "You did." After a while I got up and went to the barn and brought the cedar box back in and put it under the bed. Clara was already in her room. She had the small room off the kitchen. I'd cleaned it as well as I could, and I don't know if she heard me. Probably she did. The floor in that hall had a board that always spoke. That night I lay on top of the bed, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about what she'd said. This is her house too. Something about hearing that, about a stranger coming into this place and saying Ruth's name without awkwardness, without that particular careful silence that people put around the dead like a courtesy that is really just their own discomfort dressed up. It moved something in me that I hadn't known was frozen. It was like she'd given Ruth back to the house, given me permission to have her here without hiding her, and somehow that made the house feel less wrong than it had in 4 years. 10 days in, one of the steers got out through a gap in the east fence, the section I'd checked the morning Clara arrived, which tells you something about where my head had been at, and came up lame after getting its back leg through the wire. Denny found it at first light and came and got me, and we spent the better part of the morning getting the steer out without doing more damage and patching the wire. By the time we got back to the house, it was close to noon, and I was filthy, and in a poor temper because I had a meeting in the afternoon with a buyer from Tucson, and I needed to be cleaned up, and I'd lost the whole morning to one stupid steer, an offense I should have fixed properly 3 weeks ago. Clara met me at the door. She'd already heated water. She had my good shirt hung and pressed. She'd found the iron. I didn't know where I'd put it. I hadn't used it in probably 2 years. She had food on the table. She didn't say anything about the shirt or the water or any of it. She handed me a plate and sat down across from me and said, "How bad's the steer?" "He'll live, lose some weight before he's right." "The fence?" "Patched. I'll do it properly this Sunday." She nodded and picked up her fork and we ate. I got cleaned up and made it to the meeting. The buyer was a man named Kellstrom, out of Tucson, looking to fill a contract with a mining operation that needed beef. The numbers were fair, better than I'd expected, and I rode home with the signed paper in my vest pocket and the particular quiet satisfaction that comes from a good day's business after a bad morning. That evening Clara was on the front porch in the old wooden chair Ruth used to sit in, I hadn't sat in it since. I'd kept to the other chair, the harder one, and she had a book open but she wasn't reading. She was watching the last of the sun on the mesa to the west, the way it turned the rock the color of coals. I sat in the other chair. We watched the sun go down. "Thank you," I said, "for the shirt. It needed doing." "Still." She glanced at me sideways. "You're a man who says thank you for an ironed shirt like someone gave him back a horse he thought was gone." A pause. "When did people stop doing things for you, Elias?" I thought about that for a while. The sky was going purple above the mesa, that deep violet that came some evenings when the air was clean after rain. "March of '74, I said. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't make a face or put her hand over her mouth or do any of the things people did when I said something about Ruth. She just sat with it, the way you sit with a thing that's true and there's nothing to add to it. After a while she said, "Well, the shirt needed doing." And that was all. On the 12th day, Tomaz's boy came out from town. Tomaz had a son, 18, learning to be a printer at the Tucson Citizen, with a piece of news that had apparently been all over town since the day before. A man named Greer, who ran a spread 20 miles north, had let it be known that he was looking to acquire the mineral rights on 3 or 4 of the smaller ranches in the basin, including mine, and that if the ranchers were smart they'd sell before the price dropped. The word Tomaz's boy used was buy, but the story as it spread had an edge to it that suggested Greer's definition of buying and buying's usual definition weren't quite the same thing. I'd heard of Greer, hadn't had dealings with him. He'd come into the basin the year before with money from somewhere back east and had been building since then, acquiring, absorbing, pressing on neighbors' fences when the opportunity presented. He was not a man of violence exactly, but he was a man who understood pressure and applied it steadily, the way water erodes rock. Slow and patient, and ultimately not caring about the rock's opinion of the matter. Tomaz's boy ate lunch with us. Clara fed him without ceremony. She fed everyone who came through. It had become the way of the house. And afterward he rode back and I stood at the porch rail thinking. Clara came and stood beside me. "You know him," she said, meaning Greer. "Of him, not personally." "Is it a real threat?" "Could be. I own the mineral rights on the south 30 acres outright. Always figured they were worth something someday." I looked out at the basin, the long, low country in the afternoon light, my land running to the horizon where it met other men's land. "I'm not selling them." "Good," she said, with a flatness that meant she'd already thought it through and landed in the same place. "It might get complicated," I said, "if Greer's the kind of man I think he is." "What kind is that?" "A man who thinks eventual is the same as inevitable, who thinks he just needs to wait long enough for a smaller man to get tired." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He hasn't met you." I turned and looked at her. She was looking out at the basin with the same expression she used for everything, steady and clear, and not particularly impressed by difficulty. "You don't know me well enough to say that," I said. "I know you well enough." She looked at me then, and her eyes were level and certain. "You built this. You've kept it going through 4 years that would have broken most men. You're not the kind who gets tired into selling." A pause, brief. "If Greer's betting on that, he's going to lose the bet." I stood there for a moment. Something in my chest moved. It was not a dramatic thing. It did not feel the way things in stories feel. It felt like a knot loosening, like a rope that's been drawn tight for years finally going a little slack. She'd looked at me and said what she saw, and what she saw was not a broken-down man marking time. It was a man who'd built something and kept it and wasn't finished yet. A man worth betting on. I hadn't known how badly I needed someone to see that until she said it. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Out on the south pasture, a hawk was working the thermals in long, slow circles, and the cattle were moving down toward the water in the late afternoon way they had, unhurried, knowing what they knew. "Clara," I said. "Oh?" "I'd like to write to the agency," I said, "if you're willing." She looked at me for a moment. "Write them what?" "That we'd like to proceed." The wind off the mesa was picking up, the way it did in the late afternoon, carrying the smell of creosote and warm rock. She looked out at the country again, at the basin and the sky and the long low land I'd claimed and kept and intended to keep. "All right," she said, "then, Elias." "The window." "What about it?" "East wall, before winter." She looked at me with something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was something in that direction, a warmth she didn't usually let show, brief and contained. "I want to watch the sun come up while I cook." Something happened to me then. I don't have a better way to say it. Something happened, and it was something I hadn't felt in years, and it came up from somewhere I'd thought was closed off. I didn't know what my face did. I know it surprised me. I laughed. Not a polite sound. A real laugh, short and a little ragged, like a thing that had been stuck somewhere and finally worked loose. She heard it and looked at me, and her expression opened up, not surprise exactly, more like a confirmation of something she'd been waiting to see, and then she was smiling, actually smiling, and it transformed her face in a way I hadn't seen yet in 12 days of careful knowing each other. She had a good smile, the kind that didn't perform. "There you are," she said. A week after I wrote the agency letter, Greer sent a man. Not Greer himself. That would have been too direct for a man of his methods. He sent a lawyer type, well-dressed, with a card from a law firm in Tucson, and an offer written out on good paper that was reasonable enough to be insulting, because it assumed I was reasonable enough to take it. I read the offer at the porch rail. The lawyer stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and waited with the patience of a man who'd done this before and expected a certain negotiation. I folded the paper and handed it back. "Tell Mr. Greer I appreciate the inquiry," I said. "My answer is no. If he has questions about that answer, I'm available to discuss it with him directly." The lawyer put the paper back in his case. He had the look of a man filing away information for later use. "Mr. Greer may follow up himself," he said. "I'd welcome it," I said. After the lawyer rode out, Clara came out from the kitchen. She'd been listening, or not listening. She was good at being in a room without announcing it. "Well," she said. "He'll be back," I said. "Greer or someone he sends." "What will you do?" "Same thing." "Say no." I looked at her. "Men like Greer, they're buying when they think you're selling out of fear. Once they know you're not afraid, the math changes." She considered that, and if the math doesn't change, then we involve Frank Alderman and 2 or 3 other ranchers he's been pressing on, and we make it a different kind of problem for him. I said it matter-of-factly, because it was a matter of fact. He's not the first man who thought patience was the same as winning. Clara looked at me for a moment with that steady regard of hers. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Greer did come himself, about 10 days after that. He was a large man, well-fed, with the easy manners of someone who'd had money long enough to forget he'd ever wanted it. He came in the mid-morning, and I met him at the fence post where the road ended and the property began, which told him without any words what I thought of his visit. We talked for 20 minutes. He was pleasant. He made his case well. He raised the offer by 15% and presented it as a favor. I said no. I said I wasn't going to say it a third time if he came back again. I'd just have him escorted off the property. He looked at me then, really looked, the way he probably hadn't bothered to look the first time, when I was just a smaller man to be purchased. He was trying to read something in me, and he couldn't get the read he wanted. "You're a stubborn man, Mr. Calhoun," he said. "I'm a man who built something and intends to keep it," I said. "That's not stubbornness. It's just what's true." He left. He didn't come back. We were married in October by the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks or so. Frank Alderman and his wife came, and Tamaz, and the hands stood in the yard in their good clothes looking pleased and a little awkward, and it was a brief ceremony because the preacher had 4 more stops to make before nightfall. Clara wore the same good dress she'd arrived in, which she'd pressed herself the morning of. I wore my good suit, which fit me less well than it had in '74. After, Frank Alderman shook my hand outside and held it for a moment. He was a man who said his important things with grip rather than words. I understood him. That evening, in the quiet after everyone had gone, we sat on the porch. I'd put 2 chairs there now, proper ones, bought from a man in Tucson who made furniture. The sky was going through its colors the way it did in October, orange to red to a purple so deep it looked like it had been painted. The air had the first chill of real autumn in it, a sharpness at the edges that the summer heat had kept away. She had her hand on the arm of her chair, and after a while I put mine over it. Not a grand gesture, just placed it there. She turned her hand over and held mine. "The window's not done yet," she said. "Framing's done. Glass comes in next week from Tucson." "Good." She looked at the mesa going dark at the edges. "I've been thinking about curtains, something light, nothing that'll block the light." "All right." A pause. The sound of the cattle settling on the south pasture carried in the still air. Francisco had been right about the weather again. He'd predicted the clear cold, and here it was, clean and cold and settled. "Elias." "Oh." "What was she like?" She said it quietly, steadily. Not afraid of the question, not stepping around it, direct the way she always was. "Ruth." I thought about that for a while. The stars were starting to come out in the east, the early ones, bright against the dark coming down. I could feel her hand in mine, solid and warm. "She had a light to her," I said, "the kind people see across a room. She could make a thing feel like a celebration just by being in it. Supper felt like a supper. A morning felt like a morning worth having." I looked at the sky. She laughed easy. She was one of those people who found things funny that other people overlooked, small things, absurd things. She'd laugh at the way a calf looked at you. "She sounded like she was something." "She was." A pause. "She would have liked you. She didn't have much patience for softness either. She used to say a person who tells you the comfortable thing instead of the true thing doesn't actually care about you. They care about the conversation going smoothly." I looked at Clara. "You'd have gotten along." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the nicest thing you've said to me." "I've got limited range." "You do fine," she said. "I don't need range. I need honest." She said it the same way she said everything, plain and direct and without any effort to make it soft. And I thought, this is what steadiness looks like. Not warmth exactly, not the kind Ruth had, but something else, something equally true. A presence beside me that didn't ask me to be other than I was. That saw the thing I'd made and called it real. That put Ruth's cedar box back under the bed and said this is her house too. That stood beside me at the porch rail and said he hasn't met you. I had not expected to be valued again. I had not, if I am honest, expected very much of anything. I had expected to work and maintain and keep the thing going, and maybe that would have been enough. A life can be built on less. But this was more. The mesa had gone fully dark. The stars were proper now, the whole spread of them the way they come out in desert air, thick and clear and overwhelming if you let yourself look at them properly. I had stopped looking at them properly somewhere in the 4 years of carrying the silence. I looked at them now. "Elias." "Oh." "I want to tell you something." "Go ahead." She was quiet for a moment, organizing it. She had that habit, not hesitating exactly, more like placing things carefully before she said them. "I came out here thinking I was making a sensible arrangement," she said. "I'd thought it through. A rancher, solvent, plain speaking, a house I could be useful in, a life that was mine instead of something left over from someone else's." She paused. "That's what I thought I was doing." "That sounds reasonable," I said. "It was." Another pause. "It's more than that now." I didn't say anything. I looked at her profile in the dark, the edge of her face in the starlight. "You're a good man, Elias Calhoun," she said. "I don't say that lightly. I've known men who weren't. What you've built here, what you've carried, most men would have sold and gone back east, or drunk themselves into a different kind of ruin. You didn't." She turned and looked at me, and in the dark I could still see the directness in it, the Creekwater steadiness. "I'm glad I came." I sat with that for a moment. The weight of being seen, clearly and without softening, by someone who didn't have to say a thing. She'd come here to make a sensible arrangement, and she was telling me it had become something more than that. And she was telling me the way she told me everything, plain, without performance, as a fact she'd arrived at and was reporting accurately. "I'm glad you ducked," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she laughed short, genuine, with a little surprise in it. "The lintel. The lintel. You really should fix that." "I know." "And the hinge." "I know." She shook her head, not quite seriously. "You're going to fix the window before you fix the hinge, aren't you?" "The window matters more." "It does," she agreed. And there was something in how she said it, simply, without irony, because she understood exactly why the window mattered more, and had understood it from the first morning when she'd stood at the east wall with her hands on the sill. That settled into me like a stone settling into good ground. I think about the Cochise Treaty sometimes, the one they'd made in Arizona some years back, the idea that two peoples who'd been at war could make a peace that held not because they'd stopped being different, but because they'd looked at each other honestly and found something worth preserving. A peace made from truth rather than pretending. That's a harder thing to build, and it lasts longer. That's what I'd found in Clara Voss. Not what I'd had with Ruth. That was its own thing, irreplaceable, and I'd stopped trying to replace it the night I put the cedar box back under the bed. What I'd found was its own thing entirely, a steadiness that matched mine, a woman who'd come to a hard country in an honest spirit and looked at what was here and said, "All right, this is what we have, this is what it is." The east window went in the following week. I did the glazing myself. I'd done it before. It wasn't complicated work, mostly patience and a steady hand. Clara stood in the kitchen while I fitted the glass and watched without hovering, which was her way. When I set the last pane, she came and stood beside me, and we both looked at the wall where for years there had been nothing, and now there was light coming through. Morning light, dusty and gold in the October morning, falling across the kitchen floor in a long stripe that reached nearly to the stove. She put her hand on my arm, just rested it there. She was looking at the light on the floor. "Good," she said. I put my hand over hers. We stood there a minute in the kitchen of the house I'd built, with the cedar box under the bed in the back room and Ruth's skillet on the hook above the stove, and the light coming in through the east window the way it should have come in years ago, the way Ruth had always wanted it. It was not what I'd had, it was what I had now. It was enough, more than enough, more than I'd expected, more than I'd thought to want again after 74 had taken the wanting out of me. A good woman seeing what was here, choosing it with her eyes open, standing beside me steady and plain and honest in the morning light. I had stopped being a man waiting for something to end. The east window faced the sun. It would face the sun for a long time yet. There is a kind of work that doesn't end. The ranch taught me that early, not as a hard lesson, just as the ground-level truth of the thing. A fence fixed is a fence that will need fixing again. A water source secured is a water source that will silt up or shift or go dry some summer when you least expect it. The cattle you sell are the cattle you'll breed again next year. The work doesn't complete, it cycles. And the measure of a man isn't whether he finishes it, nobody finishes it, but whether he shows up to it every morning with his hands ready. I'd been showing up. I'd never stopped showing up. But somewhere in the 4 years of showing up alone, I'd started to confuse showing up with existing, and existing with living, and those aren't the same. A man can exist through a great deal. The question is whether there's anyone watching him exist who thinks it amounts to something. Clara watched. That was maybe the thing I keep coming back to. She watched the way a capable person watches, not sentimentally, not with the tender regard of someone who needs you to be all right so they can feel comfortable. She watched the way a rancher watches a stretch of land he's considering buying, attending to what's actually there, the rocky parts and the good grass both, the water and the drought, making a true assessment, and then deciding what it's worth and whether she'd stake something on it. She'd stake something on it. On me. On this hardpan spread in the basin southeast of Tucson. She'd read my letter, the plain and probably unappealing letter I'd written in January of '78, the one where I said I had no softness to offer, and she'd written back and asked me to tell her the hard things, and I had, and she'd thought it over for a week and decided she was interested. And then she'd spent 5 months corresponding across a distance, asking real questions and answering mine plainly, and then she'd gotten on a stage in Tucson and come out to see for herself. That took something. I don't say it to flatter her. I say it because it's true, and I think about it sometimes, the particular quality of will it takes to move toward a thing you don't yet fully know rather than away from it. A lot of people will tell you they're willing to take a chance, and then you watch what they actually do and they're not. They'll take the known risk over the unknown one every time, even when the known risk is just a different kind of loss. Clara was not that way. She looked at a situation straight, accounted for what she didn't know, and moved. The basin in the winter was a different country from the basin in summer. The light went low and long and everything turned color. The rock went red, the dry grass went gold. The shadows in the afternoon stretched across the south pasture for what looked like miles. I had always liked the winter out here. It was spare in a way that suited me. All the excess burned off, just the essential thing remaining, the land, the cattle, the work, the cold stars at night. Ruth had liked it too. She'd say the desert in winter looked like it was thinking. Clara, I discovered, liked it for different reasons. She was a woman who'd lived through Ohio winters, gray, wet, persistent, and Arizona winter was a revelation to her. The clarity of it. She started going out at first light sometimes, before the coffee was even made, just to stand in the yard and watch the morning come over the mesa. I'd come out and find her there with her arms crossed against the cold, and her breath making small clouds and her face lifted toward the east. I never said anything when I found her like that. I'd just stand beside her for a minute. Sometimes she'd say something, a cloud formation, a remark about the cattle, and sometimes she wouldn't. We were getting good at the particular quiet that isn't empty, the quiet that two people who understand each other can inhabit without it costing them anything. That was what I hadn't been able to say to Frank Alderman that evening in '77, when he told me I was living like a man waiting to die. It wasn't that I was waiting to die. It wasn't even that I was lonely exactly, though that was part of it. It was that the quiet had become the wrong kind, the kind that cost you something every day you were in it. I'd gotten used to the cost, the way you get used to a bad tooth. You just hold that side of your jaw different and stop thinking about it. I hadn't known how much it was costing until the morning Clara came in from the yard and made the coffee, and I realized I'd been listening for her footsteps in the hall before I was even fully awake. That she'd become, in 12 days, a presence that the house shaped itself around. She was not Ruth. She would never be Ruth. She was herself, distinct and unmistakable, with her own particular way of moving through the world, direct and practical and unexpectedly funny in a quiet way, a dry humor that came out sideways when she felt comfortable, that I was only beginning to know how to catch. She'd said once, midway through our correspondence, that she'd been told her whole life she was too plain-spoken for a woman, too direct, too inclined to say what she actually thought. She'd written it without self-pity, just as a fact people had offered her. I'd written back and said I didn't understand the complaint. She'd written back and said, "I know. That's part of why I'm still writing to you." I think about that exchange now, and I know what she meant by it. I was the first man who'd responded to her honest letter with an equally honest one, who'd said, "Here is what I am, here is what this is, make of it what you will," and meant it, and didn't need her to pretend otherwise. That's not a small thing. A person goes long enough being told they need to be different than they are, and then someone looks at them exactly as they are and says, "That'll do." That's the thing, isn't it? That's what nobody told me was still possible. Ruth had loved me warm, which was her nature. Clara saw me straight, which was hers. Both things true, both things good. The night of the wedding, after Frank Alderman and his wife had gone and the hands had retired, she brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch. It was cold enough by then that we both wore coats. She handed me a cup and sat in her chair, and for a while we were just quiet, the good kind, the one that didn't cost anything. After a while she said, "I think I'm going to write to that school in Tucson about the books for Francisco's daughter. He'll appreciate that." "He won't say so." "No," I said, "but he'll show it. Watch his face next time you mention her." She considered that. "He's a good man." "He is, they all are." She looked at the stars. "You picked well." "Been lucky," I said. "The good ones stay if you treat them right." A pause. "Same principle applies in other areas." She glanced at me sideways. "Was that a joke?" "An observation." It was dangerously close to a joke. She sipped her coffee. "I'll note it in the record." And there it was again, that thing I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't identical to the laugh from 2 weeks before. It was quieter, warmer, more settled. A man sitting on his own porch in the cold, clear dark of an October night in Arizona territory, with a cup of coffee and a woman beside him who'd chosen to be there, feeling something he'd stopped expecting to feel. The east window would face the morning. The hinge on the front door was still loose. I'd fix it someday. There was no particular hurry anymore. There was, for the first time in 4 years, no particular hurry for anything.